فايس أو نائب الرئيس، فيلم جديد يطرح سيرة حياة ديك تشيني نائب الرئيس الأمريكي السابق خلال فترتي حكم الرئيس جورج بوش الابن منذ عام 2001 حتى عام 2009.
George, I'm the CEO of a large company. And I have been Secretary of Defense. And I have been White House Chief of Staff. The Vice Presidency is a mostly symbolic job. However, if we came to a different understanding, I can handle the more mundane jobs, overseeing bureaucracy, military, energy, and foreign policy. Yeah, right. I like that.
منح بوش تشيني سلطات تنفيذية في إدارته جعله أقوى نائب رئيس نفوذاً في تاريخ الولايات المتحدة، إذ كان المحرك وراء الحرب على الإرهاب بعد ضربات 11 سبتمبر وغزو العراق عام 2003 والمصادقة على برنامج التنصت الغير قانوني وتعذيب المشتبهين بالإرهاب أو ما سماه بالاستجواب المعزز.
Bush approved all of this?
No.
He's a villain to some of us and a hero to others. You as a filmmaker, you have the task to bring a new perspective. How do you do it? Where do you start?
He seemed like a very far away, shadowy question mark to me. Whereas with George W. Bush, you can kind of see who he is pretty quickly. And I really wanted to understand who this guy was, this guy that really shook the foundations of history. And I wanted to see him as a young man. I wanted to see him as a guy who's a father with daughters and a wife that he loves. And I think it's very important that we understand these people and understand that they're not just mythic figures that are good or bad.
يبدأ الفيلم بمشهد توقيف الشرطة تشيني سكرانا في ولاية وايومينغ عام 1963 بعد فصله من جامعة ييل.
You stand up straight. And you have the courage to become someone or I'm gone.
وبعد توبيخ زوجته له نقفز إلى عام 1969 عندما يبدأ العمل لدونالد رامسفيلد مستشار الرئيس نيكسون، وتدريجياً يصعد سلم القوة في الولايات المتحدة ويصبح مدير أركان إدارة الرئيس فورد، ولاحقاً عضو كونغرس جمهوري في فترة حكم ريغان، ثم وزير الدفاع في إدارة جورج بوش الأب حيث يشرف على حرب الخليج الأولى. وفي فترة رئاسة كلينتون الديمقراطي يعتزل السياسة وينخرط في قطاع البترول حتى أن يعرض عليه بوش الابن مشاركته في الانتخابات الرئاسية عام 2000. رغم أن الفيلم يقدم تشيني كرجل عائلة مخلص لزوجته ومحبا لابنتيه، إلا أنه يترك انطباعا للمشاهد بأنه شخصية انتهازية جشعة للمال والسلطة وبلا مبادئ أو قيم ومسؤولة عن مصائب هذا العصر. He ran on a platform where he promised to do these bad things. So his supporters were expecting him to do what we perceive as bad.
Well, I mean, he didn't say that he was going to invade Iraq after 9/11. That obviously
the support
happened.
of over 90% of the nation.
That was, 90% of the nation was supporting George Bush after 9/11. And then eventually he got the nation to 70% of the nation believing that Saddam Hussein was connected to 9/11. A lot of that was through misinformation. I mean, I think what happened was, W. Bush and Cheney portrayed themselves as calm professionals, moderates. And then, this great catastrophe happened, 9/11. And I think what we didn't realize that was Dick Cheney was a very different guy than, he had portrayed himself. So suddenly he was in this incredible opportunity to change government, to change the role of the vice president, history. It's a crazy story, there's no question.
This is clearly Al-Qaeda. Iraq has all the good targets.
Let's get the president back online soon.
Neither branch has oversight of the VP.
How do you think his supporters will view the movie then? Would they change their mind about him? Would they start thinking, oh, maybe he did bad things?
You know what's funny? I've always said that if you're really one of his supporters or if you're a Republican, you really shouldn't have a problem with any of this. I mean, it's sort of the story of the Reagan Revolution. It worked. They changed this country. The Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, all of it, it worked. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a tone in the end, I guess, that gets a bit tragic. But other than that, I would think if you supported Dick Cheney, you would have no problem with it.
ماكاي يقدم مشاهد تعذيب بشعة وصور مروعة لحروب تشيني في أفغانستان والعراق، ومع ذلك اختار الكوميديا السريالية في سرده، مزج فيها الخيال والواقع واستخدم تعليقاً صوتياً ساخراً. How do you feel about humorizing, for instance, in this movie, torture?
I don't think there's ever a moment where we're ever funny around that subject. I think there's moments in the movie that we're playful with, but never, ever would we do anything that was humorous with torture.
So why do you think humor and how humor is effective in conveying the message you're trying to communicate to audience?
You know, these guys are very ridiculous. They're very obvious with what they do. George W. Bush, Cheney, I mean, there's a part of us that I think should laugh at them. I think it takes away some of their power. But then there's another part of it that's very dark and tragic. And I think one of the tricks with this movie was trying to show both those sides, you know, that there is a side that we should be very solemn about and sad about. But at the same time, we also should be able to laugh at these characters.
عمل ماكاي ككاتب كوميدي قبل انتقاله إلى إخراج أفلام كوميدية على غرار فيلمي المذيع أسطورة ران بورغاندي الذي سخر فيه من انحلال الإعلام، والأخوة الغير أشقاء الذي تناول فيه ضرر الثراء على الأجيال الجديدة، والشخصان الآخران الذي انتقد فيه نظام الاقتصاد الأمريكي. وفي عام 2015 استخدم الكوميديا لصبر انهيار سوق العقارات عام 2008 في فيلم The Big Short الذي رشح ل5 جوائز أوسكار وفاز بأفضل سيناريو مقتبس لماكاي. In The Big Short, you showed us other morally bad side of some people, the bankers. How different are they from Cheney? Do you view them similarly, morally at least?
It's a great question. I think it's easy for us to get lost in our job. I think it's easy for us to just day in, day out, 9 to 5, do what we do. The people around us do it. It seems normal. It seems commonplace. And in that sense, it's an interesting comparison to draw between the bankers and Dick Cheney. Because I think it's one of those things where just day in, day out, there's a giant institution that supports what you're doing. No one is screaming or pointing at you. It just seems like it's normal.
So are they both a product of the system? Rather than, as you said, they were not born bad.
I do. I believe that these systems that we're dealing with in the modern world are so complicated. And I think there are forces that are unleashed by them that we don't quite understand. I mean, if you really look at it, you know, how long ago did we really get democracy? What is it, 250 years ago, 300 years ago? Let's even call it 350 years ago. That's nothing. I still think we're figuring this out.
ما يميز فايس فعلا هو أداء ممثليه الرائع ككريستيان بيل في دور تشيني، وسام روكويل في دور جورج بوش الابن، وإيمي أدمز في دور لين تشيني، وقد رشحوا كلهم مؤخرا للأوسكار في فئات التمثيل.
What I told them basically in the beginning was, I said, don't feel like you have to do an impression. Psychologically, I want you to put these people together in a way that's very honest. But I think what happens when you get actors that are this good, they just went so deep into them. It was kind of startling when I saw them really pull these characters together. I had the same reaction. I had the hair stand up on my arm.
But they said, for instance, none of them met the real characters.
Yeah?
As a director, weren't you concerned that they miss a proper reflection of those characters?
You know, it was a tricky thing. I mean, we obviously knew that none of these characters would be, they wouldn't be too thrilled with a movie being made. But ordinarily, you would have the actors meet the people. We were lucky in this case because there's so much tape. There's so many interviews with these characters that are out there that luckily the actors had an endless source of material they could look at. And then, there's a lot of people that know the Cheneys that we were able to talk to, obviously off the record, but they were able to get personal details. I know that Christian Bale had hours and hours of tape, and he found every little physical idiosyncrasy that you could ever have with Cheney.
We can make this work. Hot damn.
رغم تباين آراء النقاد حول أسلوب طرح وصحة مضمون فايس وتجاهل رواد السينما له، إلا أنه قوبل بالمدح في هوليوود، حيث رشح ل8 جوائز أوسكار من ضمنها 3 لماكاي، وهي أفضل فيلم وأفضل مخرج وأفضل سيناريو أصلي. حسام عاصي، BBC